Welcome to the winter series for the world languages. This series is focused on the analysis of our World Language Essential Standards, or WLES, and specifically this broadcast is looking at the proficiency outcomes in our state standards. Today's agenda includes several things. First, a welcome and sort of an overview of your control panel and things that we're going to be using. Then we're going to talk about our North Carolina Standards revision process and our timeline through 2025 for world languages. After that, we'll talk about the impact of the state standards proficiency outcomes on our work. We'll also talk a little bit about the lessons learned from the state standards toolkit. And we'll finish up with some reminders and announcements for all world language educators, as well as any wrap-up or final questions we have for today. Let's get started as part of our welcome with a look at your control panel. On the left side of the screen, you should see a screenshot and an example of what your control panel probably looks like. Keep in mind WebEx, which is what we're using, is accessible online and via the app. So depending on which browser you've logged into or if you're using the app or not, your actual control panel may look a little bit different, but basically it'll be what you see on the right, or sorry, on the left. All participants are on mute for recording. We will post this recording quite soon after this broadcast. And your control panel on the side always displays the host or speaker. You probably see my initials right now. Because I'm presenting. There'll also be some polling questions periodically in your control panel, and so you'll be responding to those just by clicking on the answers you want. And then there's a Q&A or a chat always available. When we work in the chat, especially for an activity, please make sure that you're sending your responses to everyone or to all attendees if that's an option for you on the drop-down. Some other options might be to send it just to the host or the panelists. And keep in mind the buttons at the bottom of your screen there should help you navigate it just like any other online platform. Notice if you're on the phone with us today, and it looks like we have a few who are, that little button all the way to the left is for the phone. That would be lit up. The one that has the little person symbol on it is where you can look at the participants. The middle button should be a way to click on and easily access your chat feature. And then, of course, the three little dots, as we've been taught to know, is that if there's other features that are available, you can click on that and find out what they are. When we're all done, you'll click on the red button with the X that exits you out of this broadcast. If you accidentally exit or you need to exit and then come back in, you can always do that. If you exit, then just come back in using the same link you used to get in originally. It will still work just the same way, no problem. All right, I always like to start out by asking why you're here. I like to know my learners' motivations, just like any teacher. So our first poll question is, why did you join the broadcast today? This is one you can check all that apply for you. Was it because you wanted to access professional development made for world languages? Was it because you wanted to earn 1.5 contact hours for license renewal? Was it to gather information to share with someone else, your department, your team, your school, or your district? Was it because you want to learn about the upcoming standards revision process for world languages? Or did you need to ask a question about world languages, our state standards, policy, or something like that? I'm going to go ahead and open the poll. And as I said, that should appear in your control panel on the side. And you should be able to click the answer that you want. All right. Looks like almost everyone has put in their answer. Keep in mind, the poll questions are one way to be interactive throughout and to let me know that you're participating and that things are going well on your end, particularly when we go look at our attendance report and things like that. So if you have any final responses to put in, you can do that now. All right. Thank you for responding. I've gone ahead and shared the poll results with you. It's always good to know what others shared. It looks like we have people here for all kinds of reasons. The most prominent reason is to earn 1.5 contact hours for license renewal. This is always a good opportunity to earn some credit renewal, and you will get your certificate as an email attachment about a week or two after this broadcast. So look for that in your email. Also, a number of you are here because you want to access professional development made for world languages. And that is the exact reason why we do the World Language Webinar Series each year, so that you'll have access to the PD that you need, as well as things designed specifically for your needs as K12 world language educators. We also have a number of people here because they're gathering information to share with a department, a team, a school, or a district. And keep in mind, I always post the archives, including this recording, the slides, and any handouts or links about a week after the broadcast so that you can access them and use them the way you need. I do post the slides in 3 different formats: Google Slides, PowerPoint, and PDF, so that you can download the slides and repurpose them and not have to recreate them. All right, we also have some people who are here to learn about the upcoming standards revision process for world languages. I'm definitely glad to hear that, because that's something we're going to be embarking on soon, and technically have already started, but I want as many people as possible to be involved. And finally, there's a couple people who said they're here to ask a question, so that's great. And again, you can always use the chat box to ask a question. If it's more of an individual question, just send it to me. If it's something that we could all benefit from, you can send it to all attendees. All right, so let's get started talking about our North Carolina or NC revision process and timeline for world languages through the year 2025. I know it's been a very interesting school year for everyone, but we do want to start thinking forward to the future in 2025, when theoretically we will have our new state standards for world languages. So let's take a look at that process and what it's going to involve. As we get started, though, I want to know how much you already know about the standards revision process and timeline for world languages. So for example, would you say you know a lot because you were at the webinar on January 20th when it was discussed? Would you say you know some because the information from that webinar was shared locally somehow with you? Would you say you know a little, maybe you saw the fall flank session from DPI where it was sort of outlined? Or would you say not much, basically saying you knew our turn would come eventually, or that this is news to you today? So I'm going to switch over, and you can tell me how much you already know about the standards revision process and timeline. All right, it should be in your control panel. Please go ahead and share. All right, we'll finish up soon. Please get your responses in if you haven't already. All right, you should be able to see the responses now on your control panel. It looks like we're fairly evenly split with several of you, about 10 of you overall, who said you know a lot about this or some about it already because you were at the webinar or found out about the webinar information and got it shared with you. About 12 of you said that you only know a little bit, maybe you saw the fall flank session, or you don't know much at all, and so you're learning today. That helps me know how quickly to go through some of our next slides. So thank you for sharing that. For those of you who are familiar with this, please make sure you're watching and listening closely in case I miss anything. And I've also tried to emphasize some things that we had a lot of questions about last time. And for those of you who know a little or not much, please be sure and ask any kinds of questions that you have. as we go through these next several slides. Our overall revision process and timeline looks like this for world languages. We're in the review and exploration stage for 2 years. That was kind of a happy accident, if you will. We were initially slated to begin in January of 21, so in this school year of 2021. However, because of the pandemic and the requirements that are needed to fulfill for standards revision, we got an extra year. So our sort of process got put on pause, and all subject areas that are revising standards or in that timeline got an extra year to do whatever stage they were in. So for us, that's review and exploration. So we'll be in this stage this school year and in the 21-22 school year as well. Then when we move to the revision stage, this is where we would actually write new standards. That will be in the 22-23 school year. Following that, we'd have our initial installation, which would be the 23-24 school year, which is where we'd be doing a lot of professional development about the new standards, but not implementing them yet. And then implementation would officially start in the 24-25 school year. So think about the fall of 24 is when we would start with our brand new standards in the classroom. Until then, we have our current standards, which we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about and considering how we might improve. Also, during the implementation phase, when we first have that opportunity to implement our standards in the classroom, that will likely be the same school year where our textbook selection process will happen for world languages. I do have proposed on this slide, by the way, because if anything changes, our timeline might change, although I'm feeling more and more confident every day now that we have actually started a review and exploration phase, that this is the timeline we will have for world languages. So let's take a closer look at what each stage of this process involves. Like I said, we're in the review and exploration stage. So this is our time to collect and review feedback and data through various methods. We're having a webinar today. That's one of the methods. We've been doing some conference presentation. That's another method. We'll also be doing some focus groups virtually and doing some surveys. Well, we're in the process also of analyzing the current research on standards that are being reviewed. And so I'm taking a look at our world language standards overall and comparing them to what other states do and use for their world language standards. We're also looking at all of the feedback, data research, the state policies and statutes, our federal legislative requirements, and surveys and other stakeholder input that we've gotten not only this school year, but in years past when people have shared their feedback. And we're going to evaluate the findings and share those recommendations for standards revision with the State Board of Education. Our process now, after the review and exploration, is to take all this information that we've gathered and then make a presentation to the State Board of Education about what stakeholders are saying, whether we actually will stay with our current standards or if we will ask for their approval to go ahead and revise our world language state standards. It is likely, much like the other subjects have done, that we will be given approval to revise and update our state standards. One thing to know, the things that just went orange on the screen are those things that we are already doing as part of the review and exploration process. So like I said, we're having webinars, we're doing conference presentations. The purpose of that is to collect and review feedback and data. And we are reviewing all kinds of things like state policies and statutes about world languages, research, all of those things that we know that we're currently working on. After the review and exploration stage, if we do get approval to update our world language standards, we will move into the revision phase in the 22-23 school year. That will involve establishing and convening a standards writing team. Some of you may remember when we did that last time, we simply had an application online that you could fill out if you're interested in that kind of work. It sort of detailed what we would be doing. And assuming this is our timeline, that application would come out in the fall of 22 at the earliest. So keep that in mind if you're interested, but it'll be a while before we reach that part of the process. The standards writing team will draft a set of standards, and then we will share that with local districts, with charter schools, and with everybody we can for at least 30 days of review and input. Sometimes it's longer than 30 days. You may know that from being involved with the standards revision process with other areas like social studies or science or English language arts. And then we'll take that input they give us. We'll compile that feedback. We'll share it with the writing team, what everyone said. And then we'll reconvene the writing team to review the feedback and incorporate the changes that have been suggested as necessary. After that, we share additional drafts for stakeholder review and input as appropriate. Typically, 2 or 3 drafts of new standards have been shared and for input before we move to the next part of asking the State Board of Education to review the new standards and approve them. And that is the last step, actually, of the revision process, to submit those revised standards to our State Board of Education. Once the State Board of Education approves them, we move to the next stage, installation, in the 23-24 school year. That's where we launch and disseminate a state-level standards implementation plan to districts, to charter schools, and all of that, so they can use that to build their own local implementation plan. And that's sort of an overview of the steps we're going to take to do professional development and to do training with the new standards so that everyone is ready to implement those the following school year. We will also, during that installation year, modify and update our instructional toolkit components like our unpacking documents, our administrator guides, and things like that that support the standards. We'll also facilitate statewide training and support for everyone on the newly revised standards. So we'll have a series of workshops and webinars and all kinds of trainings that you'll be able to access in different ways so that you can become familiar with the standards in the way that works best for the programs and languages that you're involved with. And finally, we'll always collect data and evaluate the installation work so we can continually improve. After that year, the final year of implementation is when we actually start using the new standards in our classrooms. So we'll begin teaching with the new standards in districts and charter schools throughout the state. We'll continue to update and add instructional toolkit components as needed or as requested to support the standards. We'll also continue to facilitate statewide training and support for educators on the new standards, and that won't stop with this implementation year. That kind of training will go on, much like the webinar series we've been doing for many years now. It changes over time as to what we're offering, what the content is based on need, but it all started with implementing our new World Language Essential Standards back in the fall of 2012. And again, we'll always collect data and evaluate the implementation work as we go. I also mentioned earlier that this is likely the year that our textbook selection process will commence. That's something that's managed by the Textbook Commission and others, but we'll have input into that, and so they will let us know when it's our turn to be on the textbook selection process. So again, that's our overall standards revision timeline and process for world languages. And so now I want to ask you, which of these statements most closely matches your thoughts about our standards revision process and timeline? Would you say, hey, this is a good plan, you're looking forward to watching it progress and providing input? Would you say it's a long plan, it'll be interesting to watch it unfold over 5 years? Would you say it's the same plan as other content areas, so maybe we'll benefit from their lessons learned? Or it's an interesting plan and you're still thinking about this and need time to reflect? I'll go ahead and run this poll so that you can share where you're at with thinking about our new standards. All right, go ahead and get your thoughts in. Thank you, everyone, for being so quick in responding to the questions today. I appreciate that with our polls. All right, time's up. I'll go ahead and show you the poll results. All right, so the most popular answers were the first two, that this is a good plan, but it's a long plan. And that is very true for both. This is a process that has been refined over time and now is part of our statewide policy for the revision of all standards. But it does take some time, and it's a process that rolls out over, as you saw, 4 or 5 school years. There's also some people who say, well, it's an interesting plan, but they're still thinking about what they think about it, so that's fine too. And as you noted, there's 1 or 2 people who said, well, this is the same plan as other content areas, so maybe we'll benefit from lessons learned. So you may have heard recently in the media, speaking of other content areas and learning lessons, so social studies standards, the brand new ones, were approved at this month's State Board of Education meeting. And so you'll probably hear a lot about your social studies colleagues starting to work the next stage of their plan as well. All right, well, thank you for sharing about that. And I hope you've got sort of a better idea in mind of what our standards revision timeline will look like, and that you're thinking about how you can become involved in addition to what you're doing today by becoming involved by attending this webinar. So let's move on to the next part where we talk about the impact of our state standards, and particularly when we talk about impact today, I want us to look at our proficiency outcomes. We've got a few screenshots there of different parts of our standards. You see the cover of our standards, you see the actual proficiency scale that we use with our standards, and you see the actual proficiency scale also as the inverted pyramid. You may know already that North Carolina was the first state to have K12 state standards for world languages that were proficiency-based. This really helped us out when we think about language learning and helped us in communicating with parents and other stakeholders about what it means to know a language and to be able to use that in real ways in the world. And so we're very proud of the fact that we were first with proficiency-based. We got a lot of support from ACTFL, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, our national professional organization that also has this actual proficiency scale for everyone. And we got a lot of support from our colleagues in other states who pretty much followed suit. And so now most state standards for world languages are in fact proficiency-based like ours. It's interesting too because some of them not only have proficiency-based standards, but they've already gone through at least one revision process. So there's lots of things we can learn from them, but we need to start by looking at our own standards and think about what we've learned in implementing them these past several years. So let's start by looking at our standards in general. I think most of you are familiar with this graphic. It's called the Weave graphic. It shows how our state standards are structured with our 4 essential standards: interpersonal communication, interpretive communication, presentational communication, and culture, and then how our strands are woven through each standard at each proficiency level. So we have connections to language and literacy, or CLL, connections to other disciplines, or COD, and communities, which is abbreviated CMT in the standards. So that's how they're structured, but let's take a closer look at this component that we share in the administrator guides and what it means about our standards. There's a portion here that's included in our state standards document and also in the administrator guides about the actual proficiency guidelines. And that's what we saw before with that actual proficiency scale. In the actual proficiency guidelines, as it says, each proficiency level has a description of what students can do with the language at each level and with each communication skill. So I want to pause for a moment and think about that, because what you see right now is the entire actual proficiency scale, although we don't use it all in K12 standards, and that's pretty common across other states as well. One thing that we really benefited from North Carolina in having proficiency-based standards is a much better understanding of proficiency and what it means to our learners, and honestly what it means to us as lifelong learners of a language and multiple languages, because you can always be improving your language skills, whether it's your first language, your second language, your third, or so on. So you may have seen these graphics. The one on the right is the actual inverted pyramid, like I said, and it's inverted for a purpose. It starts at the very lowest level, which is novice low, and as you can see, as language grows and develops and becomes more complex, there's a larger and larger section for each proficiency level and sub-level as you go up towards the top of that inverted pyramid until you reach distinguished. And if you think about your own language development, whether it's your first language or your second language or others, that's how language acquisition works. That's how you begin to use and understand language in the different skill areas. Another way to think about it is levels defined by tasks. And so you've probably seen this graphic as well. And so in North Carolina, we look at things like the novice, the intermediate, and the advanced level. And we've actually associated some icons with them to help educate our students and parents and other stakeholders about what language proficiency is and what it looks like and sounds like at different proficiency levels. So the novice level is what we call the parrot level. So we have a little icon of a parrot. That's where a student can communicate minimally with things they've memorized. Rote utterances, lists, or phrases, very short words or phrases that they've memorized and use those to communicate, just like a parrot does when you teach a parrot to talk. The next level up is what we call survivor stage. This is where a learner can create with language. They can ask and answer simple questions on things that are familiar to them, and they can handle a simple situation or transaction. And we call this a survivor because if a student had to rely on their language skills at this level, they could in fact survive. They could find food, they could find shelter. Some of their language might not be perfect or too pretty or whatnot, but they could get the job done and they would survive. At the advanced level, we call this the storyteller level because at this point, a learner can narrate and describe in all the major time frames, so talk about the past, the present, and the future. They can handle a situation with a complication because they've got enough language to switch back and forth to ask detailed questions or to get additional meaning from the language they're hearing or seeing. And for us in North Carolina, we've also started to add what we call the parakeet level below the parrot. So even if students are learning language, let's say an exploratory class where they're getting, let's say, a sample of 3 or 4 different languages they might take in high school, if they're middle school students, that's the level where you aren't really building proficiency yet, so you're not on this proficiency scale or in the inverted pyramid yet, but you're starting to get some basic words and things that you could move into the novice level or that parrot stage with. For our North Carolina World Language Essential Standards, you see I've sort of drawn a line and put our cover up because in our standards for K12 study, we've said that the highest proficiency level we feel a student could reach would be the advanced mid-level. Obviously, there are levels beyond that people could reach, anyone could reach, with enough practice and work in the language. But advanced mid is as far as you can go when you're studying a language K12 because of the experience and so forth and the complexity of language beyond that level. So that's where we sort of draw the line in our K12 standards. Take a moment and consider where you are in your languages. Look at those brief descriptions. Think about what proficiency level you would be in. I'm going to pause for a moment while you do that. So before we go on, I will tell you, or you may already know, that when a student, let's say, is earning their seal of biliteracy that we offer here in North Carolina, the Global Languages Endorsement or their seal of biliteracy, they have to reach at least the intermediate low proficiency level. When you get certified to be a teacher in North Carolina and in most states, you have to be at least at the advanced low proficiency level or higher. Most people, even in their first language, usually operate in the advanced ranges of proficiency, low, mid, or high, depending on what they do on a daily basis and what kind of work they're engaged in. So if they're involved in things like communications or something like that, their proficiency level would probably be a little higher. But most people operate in that advanced range, just even in their personal lives as well as their professional lives. All right, on the next slide, there's a lot of information, and I apologize, the screenshot is not great, but what I want to share with you is that this document kind of helps us also see what language proficiency is and how it can be used. So I'm going to put that in the chat so you can click out actually to this poster I've got the PDF version. This is Oral Proficiency Levels in the Workplace. It's from Actful. That's a free PDF download, but you can also buy it as a poster if you like. But what it shows is, again, those proficiency levels, and this one's been marked up to show kind of what happens in a typical K12 language learning experience. As you can see, novice high is about where a typical K12 learner is if they take 2 years of language. So that could be levels 1 and 2 in high school. It could be a couple of years at middle school or elementary, but this is roughly where they would be after 2 school years of study. A third-year learner might be up into the intermediate range, maybe intermediate low. And then as we move into things like advanced placement or international baccalaureate programs, those require a bit higher level of proficiency to perform well in the exams and so forth that go with those courses. And if students are in an immersion program like dual language immersion or DLI, and they stick to it and continue learning their language all through high school, they can sometimes reach that intermediate high or advanced low level, or even a little bit higher, depending on the individual and the program. So that's kind of an overview of what language proficiency is in the K-12 spectrum. If you take a look at this oral proficiency levels in the workplace, you'll see that it covers, again, those language functions. In the middle, there's information about what professions and positions you can hold if you have that level of proficiency in a language. Notice there's really nothing you can do in career or work until you reach the intermediate mid-level. And then on the right-hand side, there's examples of who is likely to be at those proficiency levels and what kind of education in language, formal education, they would need. So it's kind of a guide to help us think about progress in a K-12 world language program and what that means when it comes to proficiency outcomes. I would also like to note that this poster was put together some years ago, and North Carolina did in fact have input into this and had a hand in organizing this poster the way it is, and it being published by ACTFL first as an insert in their Language Educator magazine, and then as a poster and provided online, as I said. So let's take a closer look at our state standards proficiency outcomes and what we actually focus on here in North Carolina with our standards. Once again, I've put the actual proficiency scale up from our administrator guide in the inverted pyramid. I've cut it off at advanced mid just to remind us all that advanced mid is as high as we're focused on going in K-12. And remember that our clarifying objectives are organized this way. First, by the proficiency level outcome, which is what we expect students to reach by the end of a course or program that they're in. And so that proficiency level outcome is abbreviated with the abbreviations you see on the left-hand side. So NL for novice low, NM for novice mid, NH for novice high, and so forth. Then the clarifying objectives are organized by strands. So it'll say CLL, connections to language and literacy, or COD, connections to other disciplines, like we saw before in the weave graphic. And then they're organized by standards. So standard number 1 is interpersonal communication. Number 2 is interpretive communication, so reading, listening, and viewing. Number 3 is presentational communication, so writing and formal speaking. And number 4 is culture. And after that, they're numbered by where they are on the list of clarifying objectives. So here's a screenshot of, as you can see, our novice low objectives with the NL from the CLL, Connections to Language and Literacy strand. This one's for standard 2, because that's what that 2 is right after the CLL abbreviation. So that's interpretive communication. And then we've got 5 of them, so they're numbered sequentially in our standards like this. That's what our standards look like, and that's how it's structured with our proficiency outcomes. Some other things to consider when we write standards, and certainly when we wrote standards before, are that we have to include the things that we are focused on as a state in policy. And so our state standards proficiency outcomes are part of this future-ready students approach that our State Board of Education has had for some time now. Currently, our State Board of Education, you see their seal there, wants students to graduate. They want every public school student in North Carolina, in fact, to be empowered to accept academic challenges, prepared to pursue their chosen path after graduation, and they want to encourage them to become lifelong learners and be able to engage in a globally collaborative society. So that's the official vision statement. You'll notice on the right-hand side, there are 3 little graphics that show students. The one at the bottom of the page is what's called Nikki. In fact, they're all called Nikki because Nikki is just a neutral name, could be for a boy or a girl. And Nikki as an elementary student, you see us at the bottom. Nikki as a middle school student is the one in the middle sitting cross-legged on top of the books. And then Nikki as a graduating senior is there nearest the State Board of Education graphic. And so that's the vision that our State Board of Education has for Future Ready students. On each Future Ready student, you see there's a lot of little labels, and you can look at them more closely when you have a chance, and it's also in the notes of this slide. But these are the 17 Future Ready skills that all students need when they graduate. And they include things like being bilingual and biliterate and focused on literacy. And include things about being culturally sensitive and competent in interacting with others and be able to communicate effectively. So there's a lot of skills that they need, and almost all of them are either part of world languages or refined in a world language classroom. Now, our state standards proficiency outcomes have been set to be challenging yet reasonable expectations. When we did this originally, when we were writing our standards in the 2009-2010 school year, we looked at every bit of published research we could, not only about language acquisition and building proficiency, but specifically about that for K12 learners. We also drew on a lot of educator expertise across the state, veteran teachers who had worked for years in their language or program, as well as newer teachers who were coming from a different background, and those who had learned their language, let's say, through study abroad or by living abroad and working abroad. We also reached out to our colleagues in other states who do research and work on this idea of language acquisition and building proficiency to get their feedback. So again, these outcomes are said to be challenging yet reasonable. Also, our proficiency outcomes are available for each type of program we have K12. We left no one out. Everyone who builds proficiency in their course or program has proficiency outcomes to work towards. This helps them focus on performance in the class, because in any classroom, you know that you're always building your students' skills up, usually pushing them beyond just a little bit what they would have to do on their own. Because when we talk about proficiency outcomes, we're talking about what a student can do independently with the language outside of the class or in a real world situation. And so we need to make sure that they've gotten lots of chances to practice that performance in class and maybe even push them a little beyond what we would say is their true proficiency level or outcome, because that proficiency outcome is measured by what they can do independently of our classroom or formal instruction. We also differentiated the proficiency outcomes on several different things, again, based on research and expertise. We differentiated for language type. So English, which is what a lot of our students come to our world language classrooms with, is an alphabetical language. And it is easier, particularly when you're learning to read and write, if you're going from one alphabetical language to another. So if you've got a native English speaking student who's learning Arabic or German or French or Spanish, all of which are alphabetical languages, it's easier for them to transfer their skills than it is if they're learning something like a logographic language, like Chinese or Japanese, where you don't have an alphabet that has sound tied to the letter, but in fact you have meaning tied to a symbol in logographic classes. So we differentiated based on that. We also looked at instructional time. Obviously, building proficiency is somewhat bound to time and practice. And so we looked at how long classes were. What's a typical high school class like? How does that look in a traditional schedule versus a block schedule? Or if you have a dual language immersion program, what is your instructional time division? Are you an 80-20 program where you're 80% in the DLI program language and 20% in English? Or is it some of this equation like a 50-50 program? Because time in the language and instructional time helps build proficiency. We also looked at the developmental level of students. If you've had experience teaching across the K12 spectrum, then you already know that working with elementary students, particularly young elementary students, is different than middle school and is different than high school. Our youngest elementary students, our kindergarten through second grade, come to us usually without a lot of reading skills and writing skills in their own language. And developmentally, they're still working on fine motor skills that they will need for writing. And so that's a different set of developmental issues when you're trying to teach them a second language to read and write than it is when you're working with a middle school student or a high school student who already has those skills in place and has practiced them for a number of years in other classes, including English language arts. So we looked at the developmental level of students very carefully. So for this next part, we're going to go through and talk about what the proficiency outcomes are for these different languages and programs. Now, I promised you that all of our K12 courses and programs have proficiency outcomes. So now I want to know from you, which type of programs do you teach in and or supervise for world languages? I'm going to run that as a poll question like we had before. And I just want you to indicate whether you're with FLES, like Foreign Language Elementary School, which is early start and middle school programs, whether it's K5 or K8, whether you're with language immersion programs, whether you're with high school credit heritage language programs like native speaker programs, or whether you're working with classical languages like Latin, or modern languages, alphabetic, logographic, or visual, which is American Sign Language. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll open that poll. Please go ahead and check off all of the programs or languages that you teach in and or supervise if you're an administrator of some kind. All right, get your answers in. I'm going to share the results with you so you can see what everybody said. Not a big surprise. The most common type of program here for our afternoon broadcast is our high school credit modern languages alphabetic. So teaching things like Spanish 1 through 4, or French, or Arabic, or Cherokee, or whatever language it is. That is the most common type of program in North Carolina. But I also see we've got a little of everything else too. We've got 5 people each from high school credit heritage language programs, which are for, used to be called native speakers programs, but we refer to them as heritage languages now, as well as about 5 people who are here from dual language immersion or DLI programs. We also have about 5 people from K5 or K8 FLES, or elementary and middle school programs. And finally, we've got some folks from classical language programs like Latin and Ancient Greek. And to round it out, we've also got someone who works with modern language with visual programs like American Sign Language. So something for everyone. That's good to know. So as we go through this next section where we're going to look at proficiency outcomes for everyone, I will let you know I have a slide literally for all of those programs, but it's good to know how many folks we have in the audience for each one, because I'm going to ask you to focus on some questions specifically for your particular proficiency outcome charts we're going to look at. And these are what we call our impact questions on proficiency outcomes. So first and foremost, as we go through this section, be thinking about and jotting down your answers to these questions. So just on a note, maybe a Post-it or something you have close by, think about, are the proficiency outcomes for your program or courses on here set too low, too high, or just right for the language or programs? So really consider that. Too low, too high, or just right. Also, how do those proficiency outcomes for the language or program impact both teaching and learning? Because when we think about implementing our standards, we have to think about how we're going to teach them, what are our instructional practices and so forth, but also how does the learning work for students? So how do those proficiency outcomes that you're going to see impact teaching and learning? And finally, what is one piece of feedback or one question that you have that you can share about the proficiency outcomes for your languages or programs? So I'll pause a minute so you can look at those 3 questions and make a note of what you need to do. You really only have to think about it for the languages or programs you work with, but you're welcome to look at the other proficiency outcome charts just for comparison purposes to see how they're similar or different. All right, let's begin. And by the way, the charts I'm going to show you are directly out of our state standards. The first one, which was our most common, was the state standard proficiency outcomes for high school credit modern language programs for alphabetic courses. I have put on each slide the languages for each type of program that are taught currently in North Carolina. Some of you may know already we have 18 different languages. Most of them are taught as high school credit modern language programs, and here are the alphabetic ones you see at the top, from Arabic through Urdu. Notice that on the left-hand side, we have our different standards. We sort of have our charts arranged interestingly, where we start with interpretive communication, like listening and reading, which is standard number 2. Then we have interpersonal, which is standard number 1. And then we have presentational, which is standard number 3. And for each level of course, through level 8, we have what proficiency outcome or what level of proficiency a student should be able to demonstrate independently by the time they reach the end of that course. I'll pause a moment so you can look at that a bit. And again, like I said, these charts are directly out of the standards. You may have also seen other versions of them that use our icons, like the parrot and the survivor, but we want to focus just on the ones from the standards document itself. I'm also putting in the chat box, in case you want it, a link to the standards tab on the World Languages Google site, where you can download our state standards as either a Word or PDF document if you need it. So one thing to always look for in these proficiency outcome charts is where there are differences. So if you look across, for example, all of the skill areas that we're looking at with proficiency development, you'll see that for the most part, it's one sub-level by level of proficiency. So level 1 is mostly novice mid, level 2 is mostly novice high, except for presentational speaking. So once you think about that, particularly as educators and experienced educators, and think about why that would be the case, because remember, these were set up based on research and feedback from educators and how that worked together developmentally for students who might be taking high school credit courses. All right, so moving on, the next chart is similar, but a little different. This is the same chart for high school credit modern languages, but now logographic languages like Chinese and Japanese. This is a little bit different. Remember we said about logographic, because we're mostly dealing with native English speakers from an alphabetic language. When we move to logographic, things like reading and writing are impacted. And so the expectations we would have would be different, because students are making that transition into a system that is a little bit different than the one they're used to with their first language. You may want to consider, especially if you're a person who teaches or does administration with multiple languages, how these languages compare to each other. They are quite similar. And particularly with things like interpersonal communication, which doesn't require reading and writing skills hardly at all, usually the proficiency outcomes are about the same for a similar type of language. So for like high school credit classes, you're probably going to find mostly interpersonal communication to be the same. But the other two, interpretive and presentational communication, will vary. All right. So let's go ahead now and move on to another high school credit modern language program, and that's visual language. This is ASL, American Sign Language. ASL has been a modern language just like French or Chinese is since 2007 officially, when our legislature declared it so, and it was added officially to our World Language State Standards. It has continued to grow, and I will tell you that right now ASL is the second fastest growing language we have in the state. Couple things about ASL. It's similar, again, to all the other high school credit modern languages in that it has 8 levels of courses in the state standards that you can offer to students. It has the same set of standards, although they're called something a little bit different when you go to work with visual languages. So if you take a look, interpretive communication, which was listening and reading, is now what's called receptive in the visual language world. And so receptive, meaning you're watching someone sign. So that's kind of like the version of listening, but it's really viewing. You're viewing the signs. And that's called receptive communication. because you as a learner or as someone communicating using ASL just receive that information and you have to interpret it just like interpretive communication states. For reading, in the state standards, the interpretive receptive is finger spelling. So you may know about that, maybe from some exposure or work you've had already with ASL. Interpersonal communication, our first state standard, is called interactive with visual languages. And then finally, presentational communication for formal speaking is called expressive in visual languages. And for writing, it's actually called glossing. Although I will tell you with writing, because ASL is a visual language, the glossing system that they use to indicate different signs and phrases and so forth isn't necessarily something that ASL courses focuses on. So it's there if teachers want to use it, but it's not something that is typically used until you reach much higher levels or you're training to be like an interpreter or translator for ASL. So again, take a pause, look at how this chart is similar to or different than the one that you're using if you're not teaching ASL. So let's switch now to some other high school credit courses, and this time we're going to go to classical languages. And these are languages like Latin or ancient Greek. These are languages that are no longer someone's first language in the world, which is what a modern language is spoken or signed by someone as their first language in the world. But these are languages that are sometimes called dead languages, although we don't like that term. And our Latin teachers, as well as the classical language community, has said a better term is that they are immortal languages because they continue on for a number of purposes. And the classical languages in North Carolina are some of our most commonly taught languages. So here we have an interesting chart. Notice that it only goes up to 6 levels instead of 8 like modern languages. That was a decision of the classical language focus groups when we were writing the standards. They felt like 6 levels was the appropriate number to have. I will tell you that the 8 levels for modern languages is somewhat linked to the fact that we have students who are going through dual language immersion programs, and they would reach higher levels. So that's a difference between classical and modern languages, and that was because of the feedback we got from educators with experience with this language. Notice also that there's interpretive communication, listening and reading, and also presentational communication, formal speaking and writing, but not interpersonal. So they don't really use standard number 1, interpersonal communication, because again, you're not using Latin or ancient Greek to communicate on a daily basis. Most Latin programs focus on interpretive reading quite closely, and you see there as you go across the 6 levels how quickly interpretive reading skills build, especially in comparison to modern languages. The other skills like presentational speaking or interpretive listening and whatnot, if a classical language program has an oral component, are also very different, and the proficiency outcomes are adjusted to reflect that. Much like with visual languages and glossing, things like interpretive listening, like the recitation of poems in Latin or things like that, or presentational speaking, are sort of optional things that some teachers decide to include in their classical language programs, but many do not until they reach a very different level with it. Okay. So those are our high school credit classical languages and modern languages. Now let's move on to some of the other languages and programs. I'm looking here at the DLI, or dual language immersion chart, and this is for alphabetic languages, and you see the 6 alphabetic languages we use in DLI up at the top, Cherokee through Urdu. These outcomes are not by a particular level course, because that's not how those programs are structured. They're outcomes by a grade span. So you see that they have outcomes for 2nd grade after the K2 grade span. They have them for 5th grade after the 3-5 grade span, and they have them for 8th grade after the 6-8 grade span. There are also outcomes for 12th grade after the 9-12 grade span, although I will tell you that oftentimes by the time DLI students reach the secondary level, middle school and high school, they actually transition into the modern language program and take advanced courses like a level 3 or 4 or AP in their language as secondary level students. But we've got a chart that goes K12 for them regardless. And again, you've got the same, interpretive communication, interpersonal, and presentational. And you notice that you've got more ranges here. So by the end of each grade span, there's a range. And that's due to one of the things we talked about, which was instructional time. You may know that these programs operate sometimes on 100% immersion, meaning that they are learning all of their content, all of their state standards, math and science and all that in the DLI program language. Or they might be on a 50-50 program where 50% of their day is spent in the DLI program language learning certain subjects, and the other 50% is spent in the other language. And so different amounts of time yield different proficiency results. And so that's why you see, particularly starting in 3rd grade and going out through 12th grade, ranges of proficiency where a student would fall. On the next slide, we have that same chart, but now for logographic languages in a DLI environment, so Chinese and Japanese. So we have 8 total DLI languages. Once again, same kind of thing. Notice that with the logographic language, for what's primarily native English speakers, the interpretive skills, interpretive reading and presentational writing, take a little bit longer to build because of that transition of skills and how language acquisition works in general. In addition, we also have high school credit heritage language courses. And these are sort of interesting because, again, these are for modern languages. These are often used for DLI programs as their middle school language arts for Spanish or French or whatever language is the DLI program language. But they can be used for native speakers of any language. And you might know them more commonly as native speakers courses like Spanish for Native Speakers or SNS. One thing to note, I jumped ahead a little bit, is that these heritage language courses we've had for a number of years in the state standards, since about, I think it's 2005 when they were added, because we have a lot of speakers of other languages that come to us, and we want to make sure they're developing bilingualism and biliteracy in their first language as their world language that they're taking. And so you see there on the right the sequence. So Spanish as a modern language for native English speakers goes, 1, 2, 3, and then into level 4. But Spanish as a heritage language for native Spanish speakers or for immersion speakers or that kind of thing kind of starts out with Spanish for native speakers 1 as a combination of Spanish 1 and 2, and then Spanish for native speakers 2 or heritage language 2, heritage Spanish 2, let's say, is the equivalent of a Spanish 3. And then once they've taken those 2 courses, which they use to bridge into that modern language sequence, then everybody who's been taking Spanish, whether you're a native English speaker or a native immersion speaker of Spanish, comes together in like the Spanish 4 class or other advanced Spanish courses. And so again, you have a chart, and this is the alphabetic chart, like for Spanish or French or German or Greek, that students would follow for their outcomes for levels 1 and 2. It is a little bit higher. It ensures that by the time they finish the Heritage Level 2 course, they are ready to continue on in that Level 4 course for their language and continue to build their proficiency appropriately. On the next slide is the same thing, but now for logographic languages. So the example that's used in the chart is Chinese. Once again, Chinese for native speakers or Chinese Heritage 1 and 2 bridges into a Chinese 4, and you can see how it compares to the Chinese 1, 2, and 3 for native English speakers who are learning Chinese as a new language. And the same kind of deal. It has levels 1 and 2. It has proficiency outcomes that are appropriate and prepares students to build particularly the biliteracy skills that they need and maybe haven't had a lot of practice with yet, or to refine them if they've been working on them in an immersion program, and then continue on into usually a level 4 course or whatever comes next in their sequence at their school. Just so you know, we do in fact have heritage high school credit heritage levels 1 and 2 for visual languages like ASL. But since they're not yet being taught anywhere in North Carolina, I didn't make a slide for them, but we do have those outcomes, and they are on the K12 ASL page should you need them. All right, well, let's go now to our elementary and middle school programs that are not high school credit. Here, we have one chart that covers all languages. So it doesn't matter which language you're teaching or helping students learn, here are the outcomes. And these are done, as you can see, by the end of a certain number of years of study. And that's because these could start anywhere. You could have truly a K5 FLES or foreign language in the elementary school program, and it could start in kindergarten. So the end of the second year study would be first grade. But you might also have it start in fourth grade, and so the end of the second year of study would be fifth grade. And so you see how you have to stretch it up and consider how it would change based on when students are starting. So we have multiple entry points, that's what we call that. And then how quickly language can build, given that you're getting 90 minutes a week or more of instruction, because that's the minimum required by research to build proficiency, and how that is spread out and scheduled over time in a student's schedule or a program. All right, I'm noticing our time. We're actually not doing too bad on time. So we've gotten to the end of that section. You've had a chance to look at the proficiency outcomes. I asked you to consider the question, how well are the proficiency outcomes set for the languages or programs you teach or supervise? So I hope you've been thinking about that all along. Would you say they're just right? Those proficiency outcomes are a good guide for practicing performance in the classroom and then building proficiency for real-world use? Would you say that the proficiency outcomes are too low? You think most students are exceeding those proficiency outcomes and we need to raise the expectations from a state level? Would you say the outcomes are too high? Maybe you think students are not meeting those proficiency outcomes and we need to adjust them for one or more of the communication modes? Or would you say it's a combination? Some of the proficiency outcomes maybe are too high, others could be too low, maybe some are just right. What do you think? So go ahead and I will open that question and you can say how well you think the proficiency outcomes are set for the languages or programs you teach or supervise. All right, 10 seconds, get your responses in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share what you said. So about half of you indicated that you believe the proficiency outcomes are set at the just right level. You think they're pretty fair. They're a good guide for practicing in the classroom and then building proficiency for use outside of the classroom. A few of you said you believe they're a little too high and may need to be adjusted. And some of you said there's a combination. Some are just right, some are too low, some are too high, and so we need to look at that. So I appreciate you sharing that with me. It's something I want us to continue thinking about as well, because there'll be other opportunities to give feedback on this, including some coming up right here in just a few moments. But also I want us to think about this in a very realistic way, and again, to think about what impact does this have on teaching and learning when we set proficiency outcomes. It's been interesting to watch other states set their own proficiency outcomes since we were first. We did use a lot of research and expertise to do it. There were states that followed us and basically copied our proficiency outcomes. Louisiana was one. Ohio has very similar outcomes, almost identical. And then we had a few states who decided to revise some things, and I'm going to mention one, Utah, that has a lot of DLI programs. They actually set some of their outcomes at a higher level, particularly for logographic languages, than we did. However, the feedback and data they're getting when they assess language actually more supports the way we have our proficiency outcomes set, particularly for DLI, and the way some other states have them set. So that's been an interesting experience as other states have implemented proficiency-based outcomes like this. All right. Well, this is not the only thing, though, I asked you to think about. And so now I'm going to go to our other two questions. And I'm going to ask you to share with me your answers using a Jamboard. I hope you know what a Jamboard is. Please raise your electronic hand if you know what a Jamboard is. It's a Google tool, so you might have run across it there or in other presentations, perhaps. All right. Looks like a few of you know what a Jamboard is. So it is, like I said, a Google tool. So if you've got Google, you've already got it. It's a way basically to have a place to put Post-it notes or ideas as though you had a big whiteboard or piece of paper up on the wall. So we're going to use that today. I asked you the question, how does proficiency outcomes for this language or program impact teaching and learning? That was one of the questions you were thinking about as we went through those proficiency outcome charts. And what is one piece of feedback or one question to share about the proficiency outcomes for the languages or programs that you're involved with? Notice, by the way, the impact, feedback, and question are color-coded, as any teacher does. I've done that for a very specific reason for what we're going to do on our Jamboard. So I want you to take 1 minute to choose the question above to respond to. There are two questions. You pick the one you want. And obviously, the second one is kind of like two questions in one. So you only have to respond to one. On the sticky note you create on the Jamboard for this activity, you're going to title your post either impact, feedback, or question, so we know what you're responding to, which question you're responding to. You're going to write your response to that in 3 sentences or less. And you can include your name on the sticky note, or you can remain anonymous. It's totally up to you what you want to do. And then we'll take another minute to click on the sticky, and I'm going to show you how to do that here in a minute, and then start typing your answers. Once you type that and post your sticky note to the Jamboard, I want you to take a few minutes to check out the other ideas that are being posted on the Jamboard and see what other people are saying. And I'll let you know this activity will last 6 minutes from start to finish once we go over how to do a sticky. So that's how long you'll have. We're good on time, so we should be fine. So before we get started, I wanted to show you how to do a Jamboard in case you hadn't had that experience before. When we go onto the Jamboard and you see there's a bit.ly link to go to it, you'll see a control panel like it's coming up on the screen. What you'll need to do is click on the one that's the little sticky note. You see the arrow pointing to it. When you do that, it'll open up the sticky note just like that. That's a screenshot. You type in whatever you want on your sticky note, whatever the answer is to your question, remembering to put impact, feedback, or question first as part of your answer. You can make your sticky note different colors if you want to color code it to that question, or if you just like a particular color for your sticky note, you can. And then you click Save. And when you click Save, it'll post your sticky note on the Jamboard so that it's ready to go. So here's our instructions. I'm going to go ahead and put the link to the Jamboard into the chat so you can click on it. There's a bit.ly link for it, but there's also just the direct link in case that one's not working. And again, here are your two questions. Take a minute, choose a question, create a sticky note, title your post, write your response to the question, and then go ahead and post it on the Jamboard. We'll have 6 minutes. I'll go ahead and time us out. Let's get busy. All right, we've got about a minute left to go, so please go ahead and finish up a sticky. I did ask you to respond to one question, but I wouldn't stop you if you wanted to respond to the other questions as well. It's up to you. You notice, just like any kind of board or paper that you use with sticky notes, you can move them around. I see you moving them all around. Some of you, it looks like, are color coding them to the question or whatnot, or trying to group them. That's great. Thank you so much for that. All right. Thank you so much for answering this question. I appreciate your feedback. This is, as I noted before, part of our official feedback for our standards revision process for that review and exploration phase. I will take a look at these, and I encourage you to keep adding information. Don't think you have to stop here if you want to add some more and give some feedback. And also come back and read some of these. There's a lot of information here about how having proficiency-based outcomes has impacted our teaching as well as our students' learning. And so it's important to hear that and to share your perspective as part of our process in thinking about revising our standards. Another thing on a Jamboard, just for those of you who are new to it, maybe, notice that we have several Jamboards, so I can add a new one and I can slide over and look at another one. You'll see coming up on my screen the Standards Impact Jamboard from the January 20th webinar for the question we did then. So all of those are still there as well. And we had some extra space to work with today if we needed it. So again, thank you for doing that. I also saw that some people were on their phone, so they added their information into the chat box. That's great. I will be sure and transfer that. And a few of you had some trouble with the link, so there's always some technical glitches, but again, a Jamboard is kind of nice because it is free. It's one of the Google tools that we have, just like Google Docs and that kind of thing. But it is a little bit different than working with just a straight Google Doc. So hopefully you can think about maybe adding this to your work with students or other learners that you work with. All right, I'm conscious of our time. I do want us to end on time today. So we're going to go ahead and move forward into our next section on lessons learned from the State Standards Toolkit. I want to talk to you today when we talk about proficiency-based outcomes, some of the things that we have. So we have unpacking documents, but those have also led into our clarifying objectives by course outcomes, or COCOs documents, and eventually to our K12 Bridging Documents that go with our state standards. So let's just review quickly what all of those things are. In our State Standards Toolkit, and you see it here under the Standards tab, that I'll put again in the chat box for you to go to if you want to take a look at it yourself. We have the state standards posted, as I mentioned earlier, plus the unpacking documents. And the unpacking documents were sort of, let's call it a required instructional toolkit component for the standards. So all subject areas have unpacking documents for their state standards. For world languages, we created 5 unpacking documents. You see them listed here. We had one for classical languages, which was the high school credit levels 1 through 6. We had one for dual and heritage languages for our DLI programs, K12. We had one for the dual and heritage language courses, levels 1 and 2, that bridge into the others. We had one for modern languages that covered our K8, so elementary and middle school programs. And the last one for modern languages that was high school levels 1 through 8. So they're all available and posted as documents on that standards page. I'm not going to go out to them, but I will post in our chat box, and I will post with the archives of these links to them. They're posted in the Google Drive, and you can access them. They go over each clarifying objective for each course and for each standards, and it goes just directly through them. We'll click on one real quick. I'll pick the modern languages one, just so you can kind of see how they're organized. But we don't have a lot of time to look at them today. You might have seen them already. So there's an overview of the standards, some things repeated from the standards documents, just to give an overview of proficiency and the structure of the standards. And then you see our charts that we saw on the slides from our standards document repeated. We've got them all for the modern languages here. And then we launch into an area that talks about scheduling those classes and that kind of thing, how proficiency works over time, some notes about these courses, and then some course descriptions. So if you're ever looking for things for your course catalog, know that the unpacking documents have actually course descriptions that you can take and adapt as needed. Then we get into looking at each standard. And so we look at each standard and the clarifying objectives to go with it for the proficiency outcomes for each program. And so it's a very detailed document. Like this first one looks at interpersonal communication, standard number 1, for alphabetic languages levels 1 through 3, but just for standard 1. So that's how it goes through the whole thing. This is quite an extensive document, as you might guess, as are the others. So we've had those unpacking documents from the beginning. And then those unpacking documents became some other things that we needed along the way. As I said, when we were talking about our standards revision process, we always modify and adapt and update our instructional toolkit components to go with the standards. But we might add them, we might just modify what we've got, or we might create something new. And so with the clarifying objectives by course outcome, we actually created new documents. And so I'm going to take you out to that page to show you how to find those, because these have some tools that I hope you've had a chance to explore, but if not, now would be a good time. So I just put in the chat box where the clarifying objectives by course outcomes page is. It is linked up under the standards tab. So I'm going to click out there and go to the standards tab. So this is our main website for world languages. Under the standards tab here up at the top, you see that list of unpacking documents like I was just showing you. And then on our slide here, we had this. So clarifying objectives by course outcomes, or what we call the COCOs documents, or CO2s, are actually under curriculum writing resources, because they're the tools that teachers use to write standards-based curriculum, because they work directly with our standards and the clarifying objectives to go with them. So I'm going to go out to that page. And by the way, if you're using the slide set, there are screenshots of what I'm about to do, but I wanted to do this live if we had a good connection, and we do. So the clarifying objectives by course talks about what these are. And so they were developed so that people could use them to do actual curriculum writing either on their own or together with their department or team to create things like local pacing guides if they wanted to. These are all posted as Word documents, and so they're very flexible that way. And we have them literally for every course that's offered K12 in our state standards. And so we have essentially a page for each language and all of their COCOs documents and all of their information for their standards here. So you see that they're in alphabetical order. So you just click on a button and you can go over and see them. I'm going to click on Spanish because I've got to pick one. So I'm going to pick on Spanish today. On the K12 Spanish page, or the COCOs page as we call it, there's again the information repeated about the COCOs. Then there is information for each level of program. So you remember our future ready graduates, Nikki, or sorry, not graduates, but our future ready students, Nikki. This is elementary Nikki next to the elementary programs. And so there's a description of the elementary courses for that language right out of the state standards. There's all of the course codes you would need and some examples of how those would be used. And then underneath that are all of the COCOs documents. So I'll click on the one that would be at the end of 2 years, which is where our proficiency outcomes were for the first time. It just pulls up a regular Word document, nothing fancy. You see that there are the clarifying objectives for each strand and standard across the board. And you see it starts with that proficiency outcome of, in this case, novice mid. And so you scroll through that, and this is a Word document you can download and edit and adapt as you need to. The same thing exists for the middle school courses. Here's our middle school Nikki. And next to that is a description of what middle school courses are that are not high school credit courses. Again, you've got the course codes, in this case for Spanish for the middle school. And then underneath are the COCOs documents for those middle school courses. Because Spanish is also one of our DLI programs, we have the DLI literacy courses. If you're teaching a DLI Spanish program, you have all of these, and you have COCOs documents for those as well. And remember, those are in grade span. So there's a K2 document there's a 3.5, and there's a 6.8. And again, we have all the course codes for that particular language and that particular program. Following that are the high school courses, and these are all high school credit because, as we know, middle school students can take high school credit courses. So there's an explanation of what high school courses are, what they involve. There's even a section on community college courses aligned to our high school courses in case you're working with early college students who are taking world language courses at the community college campus. And again, there's an overview of all the course codes, levels 1 through 8 for that particular language, as well as some alignment information about the community college if needed. There's also details about levels 3 through 8, which can be taught as regular language and literature courses, or on things like, medical Spanish or legal Spanish, if you want to have a specially designed course. Underneath that are all the documents you would need. So if you're after the Spanish 1 document, you click on that. It pulls up from our bank, and because the level 1 document for all alphabetic languages uses the same materials, you've got all of the course codes at the top of the COCOs document, just like you have on the other ones for elementary and middle school. But that's a good reference point too for those who have multiple languages in their programs. So all of your course codes are there. We also have over here on the left heritage language courses, because those are right beneath. And so you see information about heritage language programs, you see the course sequencing information we had comparing the two, as well as the course codes for Spanish heritage courses 1 and 2, and some additional resources. Also under that, over to the right, you have information about advanced learning programs, so things like AP, IB, and Cambridge International. Same deal, you have information about what those courses include, you have links to those resources. We do include course codes. Those are not course codes out of our World Language Essential Standards, of course, but we do have state course codes for those courses. And then we have references and materials for those courses as well, if you're teaching those programs. So that's what our COCOs pages look like. There's a lot of materials there for you as educators, whether you're teaching or you're being an administrator or you're a teacher leader of some kind. There's a lot there for you to explore and use. I'll go quickly through these slides because, like I said, I just made sure we had slides that had the screenshots if we needed them. The other thing I want to point out to you is our K12 Bridging Documents. Now, some of you who've been involved in the Fall World Language Webinar Series are quite familiar with these, but these grew out of our COCOs documents and also a need to get a handle on what was happening with the pandemic and how world language instruction needed to continue in a way that was focused on those proficiency outcomes. And so what we have are bridging documents that show where students are moving. So moving across the bridge from where they currently are with their target language proficiency to where they need to be by the end of the grade level or course in the 2020-2021 school year. We have them for classical languages, DLI programs, and modern languages, because again, remember that the heritage language courses are often part of that DLI sequence, or they can be on their own and they bridge into eventually the K12 modern language programs. We don't have a lot of time to go see them today. I will put the links in the chat box. And again, if you were here for some of the fall webinar series, we looked at these extensively in that. So if you ever want to go back to the archives and see how those are used, we developed these documents over this last summer so that they would be available to folks as we started back into the new school year under remote teaching situations. So that brings us to our last activity. We have just enough time for that. We may go a little over today, and I hope you can stay, but if not, know that the slides will be posted so you can get the things like the reminders and so forth later on if you need to. But I do want us to take a moment and do a shout out. In the chat, I want to ask you which toolkit component, the unpacking documents, the COCOs, or the bridging documents, are most helpful to you in your work as an educator, whether you're a classroom teacher or administrator, or maybe a little bit of both. And how do you use it? So in the chat, I want you to put a 15-word note or shorter explaining why that toolkit component is most helpful, and be sure to indicate the name of it as the first word of your comment. So for example, I might write COCOs, because that's what I want to focus on, because I use it to write standards-based curriculum with proficiency outcomes. So those items we just looked at, the unpacking, the COCOs, and the bridging, which toolkit component is most helpful to you in your work as an educator, and how do you use it? Go ahead and do a shout out in the chat. It'll only take us about a minute. It looks like the items getting the most shout-outs right now are the COCOs documents and the bridging documents. There's several people mentioning both. Some of the COCOs say that those documents help the district come up with pacing guides, which is a great way to use them to develop your own local pacing guide, and then also to move to a proficiency-based program. Another person said the COCOs because it guides how they structure activities with authentic sources in the classroom to make sure it's at an appropriate level for the students' expected proficiency outcomes levels. For the bridging documents, one person says it's a great reference to use in writing lesson objectives, and they love that it includes I can statements. And that is one component of the bridging documents that's kind of unique. Of course, we work with the I can or can do statements that are available nationally and through Linguafolio. But having the bridging document I can statements for our proficiency outcomes was something sort of new and unique this year that a lot of people seem to like. Also, there are people who do like the unpacking documents because it serves as a practical guide for their assignments and what they should look like by grade level in middle school that they're teaching. Well, continue to do your shout outs. I love to know what you're thinking and what works best for you and how you use it. That's always a good help for me to know, not just because we're going to be revising the standards, but in fact, how we can refine those tools that we've currently got. All right, let's finish out for the day. I have some reminders and announcements. Some of you are familiar with these. Obviously, this is our World Language webinar series, and we have completed the winter series. That's today, Wednesday, February 17th. Our spring series will begin on March 24th, where we'll be looking at our World Language Essential Standards milestones, and then in May at advocacy efforts using our state standards. As I said, all the archives are posted on the webinar series information page. And I'm putting a lot into the chat box right now so that you can get to the things we're going to go over in the next few slides. But you'll have all the contact information, all the links we're going to take a look at here, including this webinar series archives. Also, wanted everyone to know that we've just scheduled a new webinar as part of this series. The class of 2020 GLE Global Languages Endorsement, our state seal by literacy results and impact webinar will be on Tuesday, March 30th at 4 to 5 p.m. Hope you can join us for that. We'll be talking about our seal by literacy, thinking about the impact it's had on our students for their recognition and future success. One thing to note, I would encourage every high school to have at least one teacher and one school counselor at that particular broadcast, but everyone is welcome K20. Also, always available on our World Languages Google site, under resources are opportunities for educators and students. That might be awards, grants, scholarships, that kind of thing that's posted by deadline. And also upcoming professional development. So we keep a K20 professional development or PD list updated all the time. So you can learn about these webinars, but other things from other organizations as well that you might be interested in using as part of your professional development. Speaking of which, we have some upcoming conferences. We have the virtual spring conference with Flank coming up next Saturday on February 27th. Those are 50-minute concurrent sessions, and they include our DLI seminar sessions, as well as DLI school site visits on Friday, February 26th. And yes, those are all virtual this year. In March, our Regional Southern Conference on Language Teaching, or SCOLP conference, is happening, again, virtual. So there'll be synchronous and asynchronous sessions, and that's March 18th through the 21st. You'll see that there are links in the chat box that I would encourage you to look at, or on these slides so that you can get more information about these conferences. That's it. We're to wrap up in questions. I always want to remind you to subscribe to our DLI listservs for world languages if you haven't already. We have one for DLI educators, Linguafolio, our world language instructors listserv, and world language education news. We also have others that are offered by DPI. So if you're at a charter school, if you're interested in global education, if you want legislative updates, if you're a teacher of English learners as well as a world language teacher, there's lots to sign up for. You can get information from all of them that you're interested in. You can go to that bit.ly link there, which is also in the chat box, to sign up for those. And I will make sure that everyone who attended today also gets signed up for the World Language Instructors listserv if you're not already. That way you get updates and announcements like for today's broadcast. The last thing is the archives from this broadcast will be posted on our webinar series information page within the next week. That will include a recording, like I said, the slides in 3 formats, and the handouts and links. Please know that for participating in the live broadcast, you do earn contact hours towards the CEU for licensure renewal. It'll come to you in an email in the form of an attached certificate approximately 1 week from today. And always note that our local education agencies or districts and charter schools do have to approve professional development offerings like that. That's it. If you need to talk with me, I'm here. You can reach me on my email or phone, or I will be here after we close out if you have an individual question you'd like to chat about. I do not have to run away. I can stay here and chat with you until we get questions answered if you need to. I do thank you for joining us today. I hope you've learned something that you can use, and I appreciate you giving us feedback on the standards revision process. That's always very helpful, and I hope you'll continue to look for opportunities to do that as we move through this timeline we've got now with our standards revision. Also, on just a personal note, I hope everyone stays safe and warm. It looks like we're in for some very challenging weather over the next day or so, so please be careful and make sure everybody stays safe.